one of our, when the interview is going really bad, we have a list of 31 questions. And one of the questions is, 45 has just been elected. Mm-hmm. And you already wrote that poem.
Yes. Yeah. It was funny, I was living in Honolulu at the time, right? And so, like, when that poem came out, or when the kind of call came out from Brian Spears, I was like, oh yeah, I'll do this. And in my hometown in Oviedo, well, Orlando area, somebody had just written that graffiti on the wall, and I was like,
oh, wow.
Ooh, kind of like the end of days kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I'd be happy to read whichever poems you would prefer.
All of the above. Seriously, the beauty of this is it's unstructured. We're interested in what's on your mind rather than what's on our mind. You're bringing subjects into poetry that aren't all that much there, and so it's a wonderful thing. I love the fact that poetry becomes a place where we see parts of the world and parts of history that we haven't seen, you know, and your work is all about that. So whichever strikes your fancy.
Yeah, I'll read this poem. I really am happy of that
It's
poem.
poetry.
And should I start or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
So it's called coolie, and coolie is like the pejorative term for an indentured laborer or an Indian person living in the Caribbean. And it's based on a kind of poem that I've invented. It's called a chutney poem. In the 1960s, there was this musician named Sundar Popo who was, I think, a musical genius in that he began to weave different musical traditions that he came from together and create something that was like particularly Caribbean, something that's not very translated and something that's not talked about. And so this is based on one of his songs.
Okay.
And it could be sung, I suppose, but I'm not going to do that. Coolie. Coolie naam daharaya hum tej pakade, Jason churi kate hamke Guyana mein aike. They made us hold the name coolie like a cutlass. It bit us, coming to Guyana. With this whip scar iron shackle name, Aja contract bound, whole day cut cane. Come night, he drink up rum for so until he wind up and pitch in the trench black water, and cry, "Oh manager," until sugar and pressure claim his two eyes. The background manager laugh at we. So come, so done. I was born a crab dog devotee of the silent god, the jungle god, the god crosser of seas. White tongues licked the sweet demerara of my sores. Now, stateside, Americans erase my slave story. Call me Indian. Can't they hear Kalapani in my voice? My breath's marine layer when I say. And so, yeah, that poem, I think that, like, one of the things is I come from this community that's not regularly visible in, a broader sense. And so, like, our history is also then obscured in that way. And so most people are like, oh, but you look Indian. Well, yeah, technically, ethnically we're Indian, but we're actually Caribbean.
Well,
so
that's really interesting.
That's a weird.
And so we keep seeing the whale.
Oh, yes.
Over and over we keep seeing the whale, and it's almost like that's a talisman, or it's you're of the sea rather than of the subcontinent.
Yeah, totally. It's the migration. Once it started in the 1800s, like, it hasn't stopped. Like, and it was the whale was something that had haunted me in my dreams, and it's like come to me like in my waking life too, through poetry, right? Which is kind of like the connecting of my mind to the subconscious mind. That's the way I see it. And the whale as like a symbol or representative of that migration over broad swaths of seas. And the humpback whale specifically because of the songs they sing, which are like ancestral but also like evolve over one season, for example. And the whales will meet mid-sea to teach each other songs, and it's like I see that. Coming from the subcontinental heritage, we don't have in my family we don't have many stories of sea mammals, right? It's not a thing. But I like to think that the voice of the humpback whale is something that you could hear. And there have been recordings,
Sure.
or not recordings, but people have talked about being able to hear a humpback whale song in the hulls of boats. And I can imagine when my
cool.
ancestors were like carted, they could
Yeah.
like hear
Right.
this strange music. So in some kind of way, like some oral or sonic baptism, you know,
Yeah.
that would like ferry them to the Caribbean. So I'm obsessed. They hunt me too.
That's
Well, I mean, you've got them in New York Harbor in the one
Yeah.
poem. They're
Yeah.
just they
Well,
show up a lot.
They've returned to New York, which
Exactly.
is like amazing.
Exactly.
And like when you think about like the immigration stuff that's happening today, it's really, really wonderful to think that the things that were like forbidden from place come back resilient.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. When we spoke with Marcelo Hernandez Castillo yesterday, and
Yeah.
wow,
oh, Marcelo's work is just fantastic.
truly, truly. You're a translations editor.
I am a translations editor, which is a new role that I've stepped into, and I'm excited about it because, translation was always the thing that brought me to poetry. I wasn't very confident in poetry when I was younger, and I didn't realize what I was doing as a translator. Translation for me came out of necessity. My grandmother had these like songs and stories and was uneducated and couldn't read and write in any language. But she had these songs and stories that, my parents, having a Western education, a post-colonial education, were taught to think that my grandmother's stories were not that important because of the record that they left behind.
Sure.
Wasn't something tangible. And so I wanted to know like what this woman knew, and when I started to learn Hindi and Caribbean Hindi specifically, I uncovered this kind of like epic tradition that was oral that we belonged to, and it makes a lot of sense. Like when you think about, of course South Asian literature is going to be influenced by the great epics, but to have that shake my world was something else. To be told, we are like illiterate, come from like, farmers, and all of our languages are broken, like we're broken people. But then to realize that no, actually that's not the case. It's like you were taught to look at yourself
That
as
way.
broken. So
And when I saw that in some of your writings, where you were talking about that whole concept of broken, it was new. It was like, yeah, of course that's going to affect somebody. It's going to affect how they view themselves in the world. Then you also talk about when you're translating, how much you have to educate the reader.
yeah. And now this is like, it's like, you see those listicles that come out about the terms and ideas that are untranslatable.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you context when I say the word for ritually unpolluted food, right? And how that could be a metaphor for like a body. How do you say that succinctly and poetically?
Yeah.
Right.
It's not the one word, it's jutha in Hindi, and in English it's
Right.
clunky.
Wow.
But there are a lot of clunky things if you try to translate from English into Hindi. So Hindi and Bhojpuri are what they call, I think it's called adjectively poor.
Okay.
Really?
Yeah, meaning that the thing about English, and the beauty of English, is the fact that synonyms abound
Yeah.
Right.
for words, whereas in other, like in some non-Western languages, I know for sure, it's not the same, and it depends on context. And so, for example, like the word whale in English, well, that means something specific in the English language, and in Hindi, when you try to translate whale into Hindi, there's not really a word for it.
Wow.
And so you would say something like whale machli, which is like whale but fish. Like,
Oh, wow.
It's a whale fish, which is like not that scientific. But there are words for dolphins, and so like things in the ecosystems of the South Asian continent.
So, how long have you been working on this project?
Oh man,
I know.
Yeah. So it's what I really like about this book of translations is that it's winding all the threads of my education together. And so from learning the language to like visiting and living in India and finally like doing this doctorate in English, I feel like it's been a lifelong project, but I didn't know it.
Right.
You know, and so when Gayatri Bahadur, the author of Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Adventure, wrote to me and she was like, "Oh, would you be willing to translate this?" I like couldn't believe that this was a thing in the world, you know,
Yeah.
that was actually written down, because so many of our traditions have been oral, and something from that era that we could like put a finger on and be like, this was published in 1916 was, you know, pretty
Yeah.
big, I think, for me personally, for my family as well. The
Right.
community, which has kind of been really receptive to this project.
There's, I guess you'd call them devotionals at the beginning of the book. There's snippets of daily life. There's this wonderful metaphor of separation and longing. And then there's almost like psalms at the end. Tell us all about
Yeah.
it.
So in the Anglophone Caribbean, this is the only documented version or first-hand accounting of, you know, indenture. And what is like remarkable about it is that he enters, Labihari Sharma is the poet, he enters the Caribbean into a kind of poetic that's already there from people who descend from African slaves, indigenous folks, and Portuguese, Chinese, Dutch. So there's like this palimpsest of like voices and songs, and a lot of them are singing or writing about fragmentation and longing. So he comes into this like this place with this kind of poetic, but he migrates this spirituality from India into the Caribbean, which adds a layer of nuance, I suppose.
Sure.
And the Chowdal songs, because these are called, it's called Holy Songs of Demerara, because during the month, the weeks preceding Holi, the Festival of Colors, in the Caribbean known as Pagua, there's a special kind of song called the Chowdal that's sung, and it means 4 beats. So the way that it's sung is rhythmically like exuberant, and it cycles through various forms. So the Chowdal to the Ulara to there's several other like types of songs that are here. The collection is interesting in that you know, after this snippet of daily life of what it's like to be on the plantation, he goes into this more, what we would understand to be a more classical sense of South Asian devotional poetry, of the Bhakti movement, where the god is the god who has form. So the god who has form, according to Kabir in the 1500s in India, is Rama. And so, and to Mirabai, the god with form is Krishna. So what Labihari Sharma does is he mixes that together. So the voice that he takes is sometimes the voice of Radha, who's longing for Krishna, and sometimes he takes the voice of Sita, who is longing for Rama. Because both of these women of Indian epics are separated from their lovers, who happen to be the incarnations of the divine. The last section, now this is the most personal, I think, in that even though the god does have form, it shows his actual spirituality, which I think is one of devotion, yes, but then also a kind of way of teaching the people in diaspora also to pine for God, or to not forget that we're in this world of illusion. And usually, like in family meetings or whatever, like when you do prayers, it's like you make the offerings to the gods, right? The gods of stone and of paper and of whatever, all of the things there. And then, depending on how late people stay, you know, that turns into singing these hymns that this is not our home. One day we're going to return to our home. And so it's like the God force then permeates all of us, and it's not just the God that is represented by the photo or the picture.
Cool. Can you read from the new book?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.